Hello and welcome to today's episode. We'll be looking again at English Literature GCSE, Paper 1, which is the Shakespeare in the pre-19th century novel paper, and we're going to be continuing to look at Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol. Last time we were looking at Stave 3, we finished with Scrooge being shown by the ghost of Christmas present into the home of the Cratchits and seeing their struggles to provide food for the family, but also their joy at Christmas. And now, of course, the spirit is going to continue to take Scrooge on a journey to see the wider life of London and, of course, around the country to show him just what he's missing out on. So let's pick up the story where we left off and continue with our discussion. By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlours, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cosy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here, again, were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbour's house, where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, well they knew it, in a glow. What's happening here is that the spirit has now taken Scrooge away from the Cratchit family and he's showing him the street scenes around London. So we have lots of families getting ready for their Christmas. We get the blaze of their fires. Of course, remember the association of light with joy and purity and goodness. This idea of heat as well, part of that semantic field of light and heat. So we're being told that Christmas is a positive time for celebration. And so we've got lots of imagery of fire and heat and things glowing and blazing to reinforce that idea. Okay. And we also get to meet lots of the if you like, the minor characters of the story. These are incidental people who aren't that significant, and yet they serve a purpose of showing a wider message about this idea that Scrooge is very much alone and not enjoying Christmas. Everyone else is making the most of it. So we get all these different families rushing around, excitedly greeting their relatives and their wider family members. We also get to see through closed windows essentially. So we have this blinded window, the window blind which has got a silhouette of guests having a party behind it. So we're on the outside looking in and seeing people having a good time. We also see a group of attractive ladies getting ready for a party, and then we get this lovely humorous moment of indirect free speech where the narrator steps in and basically says that the girls know what they're doing. They're all dressed up and looking very pretty because they're trying to win themselves a boyfriend or a husband. And that's what he means by woe upon the single man who saw them, because he knows that they're very pretty and likely to break some hearts. So everyone's having a great time and enjoying themselves. And it's quite nice, actually, some of the sentence structures here, because we get this use of prepositional phrases, and we get the narrator pointing out different things that are going on in the street. So it's almost like we're being physically shown around London with Scrooge. So it immerses us in that perspective as a listener. It's a really nice description. So we get there all the children, here again. So we get this idea of the spirit acting like a tour guide in a way. Right, let's move on. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company, and piling up its fires half chimney high. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm and floated on, outpouring, with a generous hand, its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter, who ran on before dotting the dusky street with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. So we continue our little journey through the streets of London, and we get more of the the narrator's humour. The indirect free speech comes in here. You might have thought that no one was at home because everyone seems to be rushing out and getting ready to go somewhere for a party. It's implying that there's no one actually at home to receive these guests, but of course that's just a joke. But it's just reinforcing the kind of the idea of the hustle and bustle of all these people coming and going to enjoy the Christmas celebrations. We also get this interesting use of the imagery of fires half chimney high. So these enormous roaring fires, which kind of are used to symbolise, if you like, the delight in Christmas. These huge roaring fires, obviously representing both heat and brightness, also linked to the idea of joy in Christmas, and contrast nicely with the fact that Scrooge himself refuses to have a big fire. In fact, he only lets Bob Cratchit have a single coal for his fire. So he's very stingy with these things. And so at the same time, it's showing us that he hasn't embraced Christmas at all. You might wonder what the word exalted means. It kind of just means to kind of take great joy and delight and exclaim at what you're seeing, because the ghost of Christmas Present is really happy. Essentially, this ghost represents Christmas itself. We get the sense of it being very generous. We could see it bared its breadth of breast. Wonderful use of alliteration here. B. And it's just reinforcing the idea of this character is quite large and ample figured. And I guess its fatness, if you like, is there to reinforce the idea of nature as bountiful and plentiful and able to provide for everyone. It's reinforced by the fact it's got a capacious palm, basically a big hand. And it's going around generously giving out its kind of gifts from its torch. This idea of it kind of bestowing mirth. Mirth is like joy or delight or happiness on everything it can reach. So it's enjoying kind of everyone's Christmas spirit, and it's helping people to have a good time. We meet a lamplighter. A lamplighter was a person who was hired to go around with a taper and a lighter to basically illuminate all of the gas-powered streetlights. Remember, there wasn't any electrical lighting at that time, so it would be down to an individual to go around and light each individual street lamp. So that's what this character is doing. And even he, who's still working on Christmas, is having a great time. He laughs out loudly. Some more alliteration there, L&L, because he's enjoying the fact that Christmas is so wonderful. And Scrooge is really kind of the odd one out here, because until his transformation begins, he's regarded Christmas very negatively, whereas everybody else we see is having a wonderful time. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner. And nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse, rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. So this is quite interesting. The ghost has essentially kind of teleported Scrooge to a different location. So actually what we're seeing here is a mining landscape. So the rude stone is like a quarry, or kind of the works from a mine where kind of stone's been cut out from the ground. And this idea of the landscape being very bleak, bleak meaning kind of miserable and unpleasant, kind of abandoned almost. And the fact it's a desert moor doesn't mean it's an actual desert. It means to be deserted. And the moor is an area of large flat land. So this basically is some kind of mining location. But we get some nice use of alliteration. The monstrous masses of rude stone. This idea it's a burial place of giants gives it this kind of eerie, supernatural quality. It's quite unsettling. We also get imagery of cold again. So the idea of the frost keeping prisoner the water that wants to run wherever it wants to go. So this idea of cold and dark coming back again. And remember, previously we've seen cold and dark to symbolise ignorance and falsehood and all the kind of the negative things. And those, of course, have been associated in turn with Scrooge. So this kind of location is very negative, very unpleasant. In fact, the only light we get, it comes from the setting sun. But this time the light isn't so positive. It's fiery. So it's got this kind of angry, hostile kind of quality. It's glaring. So it's been personified, turned into this judging, angry character who seems to be kind of quite sulky and looking at Scrooge, frowning. It's this idea that nature is now judging Scrooge, looking down on him and looking at him quite negatively. And it's because, of course, Scrooge has not embraced his social responsibilities. He's not embraced Christmas. He doesn't think about anyone except himself. And yet, interestingly, within this location, we get to see a group of miners living nearby. So let's have a look and see what happens at this point. What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me. See?" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire, an old man and woman, with their children, and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigour sank again. It's interesting that we see, even in this really bleak and unpleasant landscape, this kind of mining area, that we have a family of miners and their children and grandchildren all having a lovely time. I mean, this word attire means clothing, so they're dressed, really, really brightly. Gaily means brightly and colourful. So they're in their best clothing, having a lovely Christmas holiday, celebrating it. And the ghost points out, even these people who live and work in such horrible conditions, even they celebrate Christmas. They know him. So it's this kind of chastising message telling off Scrooge, saying that, if even these people can enjoy Christmas, there really is no reason that he shouldn't. And we get to see it's an interesting use of a contrast, if you like, between inside and outside. Scrooge is outside at the beginning of this moment. He starts off out on the moorland amongst the stones outside the house. Then they see the bright window and they go inside and we see what's going on inside. And then, of course, we saw that earlier with the street scenes. We're on the streets looking at the houses and getting glimpses of what's going on inside. So this idea of Scrooge being on the outside of everything, being kind of isolated and alone, partly by his own choice, but beginning to realise by seeing these things that really he's denied himself his own happiness. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither? Not to see. To see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rock, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. What happens now is the spirit takes Scrooge across the water. We get some nice use of the indirect free speech, this idea of us kind of being spoken to by someone else telling the story, not to see, to see. So it's kind of as if we're listening to someone telling us the tale, and it's kind of a nice conceit which is used throughout the story. But we get some nice use of the alliteration on roared and roared and rage, so the idea of the terror and strength of nature, again reinforcing this idea that nature is stronger and bigger than mankind. So what right do people like Malthus or Scrooge to judge it? And of course it's there to kind of scare Scrooge and make him wake up a little bit. And then we get to see a lighthouse. And in this lighthouse we've got a couple of old men, so this idea of them having horny hands doesn't mean that they're sexually frustrated. No, it just means that the hands are rough and worn by the hard manual work that they do. So they've got lots of like blisters and very, very thick, rough flesh on their hands. That's why they're kind of their work is done to them. And they're drinking beer. Grog is kind of like a cheap, watered-down ale. So they're drinking and celebrating Christmas. And again, we get this interesting use of outside and inside. So when we first see them, we're actually looking through the hole in the door where the key goes, this loophole in the, if you like, in the thick stone wall. So we've got a hole in the wall showing the brightness of their fire kind of, illuminating part of the sea. So this idea of heat and fire associated with Christmas celebrations. And meanwhile, Scrooge is on the outside. And then, of course, the ghost brings him to look closely at what's going on. So Scrooge on the outside being brought in by the ghost, who's trying to show him just how isolated he's been. Again, the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on, until being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. So on the journey across the sea, we get to see a ship, and we're told that even here, where we have these kind of sailors who are all on their own, sailing the sea together, even they're kind of marking Christmas in their own way. They're saying nice things to one another. Even these people who, whether they're good or bad people, they're still being kind to one another. They're still kind of marking Christmas. They're kind of marking Christmas in their own way, remembering their family and friends, and taking pleasure in the fact that family and friends, although they're not with them right now, are probably thinking about them. So even these isolated characters, in a way, are less detached from the world than Scrooge is, despite the fact that they're at sea. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha!" If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It's a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily, "Ha ha 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 ha!" "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too!" "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." What's happened here now is that Scrooge hears a laugh while they're looking at the ship, and suddenly that laugh transports him, and the spirit takes him back to London, and we get to see Fred's family celebrating their own Christmas. And it's very interesting that the room we go to is, of course, bright and gleaming. So again, because these people are celebrating Christmas and being friendly, it's associated with those positive ideas of light and heat. And we see, of course, the laughter of Scrooge's nephew. And then we get this lovely moment of indirect free speech where, the narrator kind of breaks into voice again as a character and says how much he likes Fred, saying, if you know anyone who's got a bigger laugh than him, I'd like to meet him and get to be his friend too. So we're being told to approve heartily of Fred because he's a good man. And of course we get this nice comparison of infection. So we get the infection of disease and misery compared to the infectious nature of laughter. It's this kind of balance to the negativity in the world. So Fred is kind of being set up as this positive life force in a way. He kind of balances out the negative things that we've seen so far. And of course, one of the things you see regularly with him is his laughter. Frequently, we just get these short exclamators of him laughing at things and cheering people up around him. Of course, then we get to see a quite pointed criticism of Scrooge, that these people are laughing, but they're laughing at Scrooge himself. They kind of take pity on him and laugh at him because he's such a misery guts. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty. That's Fred's wife. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," says Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I've nothing to say against him." So again, we get the indirect free speech of the narrator telling us just how pretty and pleasant Fred's wife is. That the idea that she's attractive, that she's made to be kissed, and the idea that Fred does kiss her. So we're being told that he's in a very happy relationship. He's kind of found a good partner in life. And this is an interesting contrast, of course, to what we learn about Scrooge. Scrooge abandoned this kind of happiness. He left his fiancée to pursue business and money. Great dissatisfaction and frustration. She left him because she realised, of course, that Scrooge loved money more than her. But so here we're seeing just what Scrooge is missing out on, this kind of lovely, romantic life. We get the positive imagery again, the sunniest pair of eyes, again, the association with heat and warmth with Fred's wife, because again, this idea of the positivity of romance, of family, and all the values that go with it. But despite the laughter at Scrooge, Fred's not really being nasty about him. It's laughter in a sense out of pity, because he says, "I've nothing to say against him." He's not being unpleasant about Scrooge. He's just going to feel sorry for him. "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" says Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it." "I've no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table they were clustered round the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. So what's happening here, of course, is that we get Fred commenting on the idea that because Scrooge is hoarding this money, he's not doing anything with it. It actually has no benefit whatsoever. It doesn't even make himself comfortable with it. So Fred feels great pity for him. And although everyone is critical of him, so Fred's wife kind of says, "I've got no patience for him." What we see from Fred is that he's just sorry for him. He has pity for him. And he points out that the person who really suffers from Scrooge's behaviour, it's not the people around him, it's Scrooge himself. Because he's isolated, he's alone, he's missing out on all his joy and family and love and the potential of life. He's on his own and miserable most of the time. And then Fred makes a little bit of a joke saying, "You don't lose much of a dinner." So he's having a bit of a dig at their meal. He doesn't really mean it. And in fact, his wife steps in and criticises him for saying such a thing. And then everyone else defends the meal as well. But they're all having a bit of a joke. And Fred's got his friend Topper round to join them. And Topper's got his eye on one of the girls at the party. And he's making a point of it that he's a bachelor, dropping a hint that he's single and hoping that he'll get the plump one, the large girl, to take a fancy to him because he quite likes her. So we're getting this kind of sense of romance and joy and fun and kind of light-hearted things going on. "Do go on, Fred," says Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. "He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. "I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers." Fred's simply pointing out here that really there's no real loss here for them. It's Scrooge who's kind of perhaps losing out the most. He's losing out on some pleasant moments with family and friends, and ultimately saying that, all that Scrooge has to look forward to is a mouldy office and a dusty bedroom, a dusty home. So really, it's Scrooge who's suffering the most from his behaviour, no one else. And of course, this has been used to kind of point this out to Scrooge, to teach him a lesson that he needs to change, because ultimately he's harming himself as much as he is anyone else. "I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something." And I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. So what Fred is basically doing is, saying that he's going to keep visiting Scrooge every Christmas, he'll keep trying, and this idea that he defies him not to enjoy Christmas. You think, no, there's no way that he can't enjoy it. To defy someone to kind of go against them, to challenge them. And so he thinks, I'm going to keep going there, I'm going to be positive with him every single year, and perhaps it may come to nothing, but even if it just puts Scrooge in a good enough mood to leave his clerk Bob some money, which we're talking about here, then that's something. It'll have some positive effect. But of course, the family just think it's a bit of a laugh. This idea that anyone could have an impact on Scrooge. This is what I mean by shaking, but I don't mean in a physical sense so much as having an impact on him and getting him to change his mind and change his behaviour. So they all have a good laugh at it. This idea of merriment is simply joy and laughter. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you. Especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among the other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing, you might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. So again, we're getting this kind of sense of the family enjoying their Christmas. They're playing music, celebrating. We get some jokes about, the appearance of Topper, the fact he's got large veins in his forehead, so he's quite a portly man. But he's joining in, singing the bass tones of this song. And then we get some nice indirect free speech. His comment that the tunes that are playing, there's nothing fancy about them. They're a mere nothing. You might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes. This little parenthetical clause is the narrator stepping in to kind of add an aside, keeping that kind of conversational tone going. But there's something interesting here. This tune is familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school. So you might remember that the child who went to go and fetch Scrooge back in the past was Fan. Fan, of course, was Scrooge's sister and Fred's mother. So this tune is obviously something that's kind of stuck around in the family, something they still play even now, something obviously that Fred is quite fond of, and they play it at Christmas time. But it's also there to kind of tug at the heartstrings a little bit, to remind Scrooge of the past when he was happier, when he had family, when he had someone who loved him. So it's kind of, again, playing on the heartstrings and making us feel a little bit of sympathy for him. When the strain of music sounded, all the things that Ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. So the music that Scrooge hears, this kind of reminder of Fan, his sister, softens him, and he starts thinking about the choices he's made in life. He starts reflecting on the decisions he's taken, that perhaps years ago he might have made different choices and ended up growing and developing as a different man. Cultivate means something like to grow or develop. So he thinks, I could have been a happier man, a kinder man. And he starts thinking about the choices he's made and also is thinking, do I really want to end up in the same way as Jacob Marley? You might wonder what a sexton is. Well, a sexton is someone who works for a church. They're like an assistant or a caretaker or a general kind of janitor of sorts. And very often the sexton will be the one who digs the graves. But it's telling that this idea that the sexton was the only other person there burying Jacob just goes to show how few people were there for Jacob after he passed away. It was literally just Jacob and Scrooge as friends. So at the funeral, there would have only been the sexton there digging the grave and burying Jacob and Scrooge watching on. So he's thinking, do I really want to go that same way? So we're starting to see him reflecting on the choices he's made. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits, for it's good to be children sometimes, and ever better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop. There was first a game at Blindsman Buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he has eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. So this is a lovely moment. So after they've played the music, they start playing games. And we get the indirect free speech again with the narrator saying, stop, look at this, look at the games they were playing. And he makes a comment on it saying that, this idea of blind man's buff is where you blindfold one person and you kind of guide them around the room. And there's this kind of insinuation that Topper, while he was blindfolded, was perfectly able to see. And this hint that Fred was helping him do it as well. This idea that Scrooge's nephew Fred was in on it because he wanted to have the opportunity to accidentally bump into the sister that he's taken a fancy to. So it's quite obvious that they're using the game to kind of get around the Victorian taboos of physical contact with someone you're not meant to touch before marriage. And he's using this as an opportunity to come into contact with the girl he fancies, basically. And the narrator saying that it's an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Incredulity, disbelief, credulity is belief. So what basically saying, it's hard to believe that what he was doing wasn't deliberate. And he was doing it in full consciousness in order to get close to this girl he likes. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, and some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavouring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. Okay, so everyone's blindfolded and bumbling around, but the implication, like we said, is that Topper can see what he's doing, and he's essentially using this game as an opportunity to get this lady into a corner where he can, express his romantic feelings for her, give her a cuddle or whatever it may be, but a little bit inappropriate. And in Victorian times, of course, it wouldn't have been the done thing for a man, a single man, to have that kind of physical contact with a single woman. So he's just using the game as an opportunity to be childish and have a bit of romance. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. So, when they take turns with the blindfolds and different person starts playing the game, we get this little knowing joke from the narrator that while someone else is playing, they seem to have gone behind the curtains together to talk about it. They're very confidential behind the curtains, so it's very obvious that Topper and this sister have sneaked off behind the curtains to have a chat, to cuddle, a kiss, whatever it might be. So she clearly likes him as well. So they're using the game as an opportunity to indulge in a bit of romance. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's bluff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeits, and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise at the game of how, when and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, that they all played, and so did Scrooge, for, wholly forgetting the interest he had had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears, he sometimes came out with a guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right too, for the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel, warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. So what happens here is that Scrooge forgets himself. He's watching these kind of games, these kind of like quizzes and things that they're indulging in, and occasionally he even gets kind of carried away and tries to call out an answer himself, not realising, of course, that they can't hear him, they can't see him there. So he clearly does have a desire to take part in Christmas, and he's starting to realise it himself. And so we get told that actually, Scrooge's got a sharp brain too, but his behaviour is quite blunt. So this idea that he's intelligent, but perhaps a little bit insensitive. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions with yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I found it out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer to the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever a tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful, on foreign lands, and they were close at home, by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope, by poverty, and it was rich, in almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. Let's look a bit more closely at this section. So we see the ghost being really delighted that Scrooge is starting to have a change of heart with regards to Christmas. In actually seeing the Christmas party at Fred's house, he actually wants to join in. He says, "Here's a new game," says Scrooge, 1 half-hour, spirit, only one. So he actually wants to take part in the game. He doesn't want to leave. He does want to join in with the festivities. But what's really kind of sad and ironic in a way is the fact that this game that they go on to play is really at his expense. They call him a disagreeable animal, a savage animal. And of course, as we go on, we realise, of course, as the sister guesses, that it's actually Scrooge himself that's the subject of their game, and a little bit of a joke. And of course, they then point out that in some respects, the question, "Is it a bear?" should have been answered yes. The idea of the aggression and hostility of a bear Bears are also very solitary, isolated creatures. So it's kind of been used metaphorically here. But nevertheless, because Fred is not an unpleasant person, he still genuinely and earnestly wishes Scrooge a Merry Christmas and points out that, okay, he wouldn't have the best wishes from me. He wouldn't take them, even if I do wish him Merry Christmas. But I'm still going to wish him Merry Christmas. And he means it sincerely. He genuinely hopes that Scrooge does have a nice Christmas because he's a good man. He's got a good heart on him. And this has had an impact on Scrooge. He's now gay and light of heart. So gay means cheerful, happy, light of heart. So this kind of misery and kind of sourness we've seen in him before is changing. He's starting to realise that if the ghost had given him a bit more time to stay there, he probably would have raised a toast to them, even though they've played a joke on him by making the yes or no game all about his disagreeable nature. He's still in such good spirits that he would have simply given the toast to them in return. And then, of course, the ghost takes Scrooge on, and we get to see a very, very compressed journey here. So a large number of changes of scene within this single paragraph. They go all over the place, lots and lots of other family homes, and every single one is happy. We get to see some lovely use of antithesis here. Let me just put this word up there. Antithesis. Antithesis is where you put contrasting ideas together. You put the opposite side by side. So the idea, even in the sick beds, that these people are cheerful. They go to foreign lands where people are far away from their families and friends, and yet they find that they feel like they're at home. Because like we saw with the sailors on the ship travelling abroad, their thoughts are still with their friends and family at home. So even they're celebrating Christmas. We get a sense that of the struggling people, even they've got hope. So the idea of struggle, one argument, hope the other. So this idea of antithesis, this idea of poverty being contrasted with richness, this idea that you might be financially poor and have very few things, but you can be rich in spirit and life and joy and family and friends. So all these things are being contrasted here through a process of antithesis, just to kind of teach Scrooge a lesson. That's what he means by taught Scrooge's precepts. Precepts are a system of beliefs. So it's this idea that the story is trying to be didactic. Didactic comes from didacticism, which means, of course, to teach. So this whole story is didactic. It's teaching Scrooge a lesson, but by extension, Dickens is teaching the reader a lesson about the real value of Christmas. Let's move on. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this because this Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment. "Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. "But I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot? Or a claw?" "It might be a claw for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here. Look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started aback, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves, rather than be party to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge would say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it ye, omit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and abide the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. One of the recurring ideas in the story is to do with time, and time becomes a bit of a motif. This idea that there's very little time to change things. The spirit has only one night to live its life and can show Scrooge the error of his ways and teach him. Scrooge has the space of the night to learn his lessons and make changes himself in order for him to save Tiny Tim. So time becomes an important motif. This whole section, though, is particularly important because we get introduced now to some of the most significant allegorical characters in the story. And it's this image of a young boy and a girl, and these are the figures of ignorance and want. Now, they're first introduced down here at the bottom of this section, so we get told they're wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. So wretched as in they're kind of worthy of our pity, they look awful. So they're quite terrifying. This word abject means utter hopelessness and misery. So they're also quite frightening to look at and quite ugly and miserable themselves. And we get this lovely list of these adjectives. Now, there's a technical term for this kind of list where the last thing added on doesn't use a conjunction. So a list comes in two flavours. We have a syndetic list. That's one that has and linking something on at the end. And then we have an asyndetic list. An asyndetic list is this kind, where we don't have an and to link it on. So it could say wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, and miserable. That would make it a syndetic list, but this one doesn't have it, so it's what we call an asyndetic list. Some slightly more technical terms there, but honestly, if you just wrote it's a list in the exam, that would be absolutely fine. It would be technically true. But also we want to try and get you using some slightly more fancy terminology to really push on the AO2. Now, these are the figures, as we said, of ignorance and want. And they are characters that are what we would say are allegorical. Let me just put this on here as well. Allegory is the noun. Means that they represent something. They're symbolic. So obviously the allegorical characters of ignorance and want represent the needs and the plight of the poor in Victorian society. Ignorance meaning lack of knowledge, lack of truth. Want meaning the desperate need for things. We're not talking about the things you want out of desire so much as the things that you need to simply survive. And so we have these characters represent the desperate situation of the poor. We get to see just how the kind of the effects of poverty have affected them. So it's kind of shriveled their skin. It's pinched and twisted them. So we get these really painful verbs being used to show just how unpleasant their lives are. They've been pulled and twisted and pinched. So we get this really nice semantic field of quite unpleasant, nasty, violent verbs showing us just how awful their lives are. And we get this lovely use of imagery as well, where angels might have sat and enthroned, devils lurked. So again, the antithesis of heaven and hell. We get the use of the angelic imagery contrasted with the imagery of hell. So the idea, of course, is simply that children are innocent. They ought to be angels. They ought to be pure and have their lives ahead of them. Whereas in reality, poverty has made their lives cruel and harsh and in some ways evil. So it's this idea of morality being brought in here because ignorance and want are being used to challenge the views of the rich on the poor. And we've been told that it's poverty essentially is the most horrible thing that fills us with dread. And of course, Scrooge hasn't yet made the connection that, these figures are partly down to him, right? And so the Spirit points out, when Scrooge asks, are they yours? The Spirit says they are man's. So he's talking here about mankind, humankind, but it's humans that have created ignorance and want. So ignorance, stupidity, lack of knowledge, and desperate want, these have been created by, the behaviour of people in society, particularly the behaviour by the wealthy, the people in the upper and middle classes who haven't really treated the poor with the courtesy, the respect, and the things that they really deserve. What we're seeing here is a warning, kind of a threat in a way, that unless things change, right, we're told that it will bring doom. So this idea is warning almost that unless the rich really kind of reconsider their attitudes to the poor will rise up and will insist on something changing. And of course, the Spirit's quite angry about it and says that unless things change, then there's no way of getting rid of this fate. This idea of the writing being raised is this idea of the lesson not being learnt. Kind of also links back, if you think back to Stave 1, you remember that we have the fireplace with the beautiful painted tiles around it, and one of them depicts the story of Belshazzar. Remember, we see the idea of the hand in the story of Belshazzar at the feast, this mysterious weird hand painting a warning onto the walls that no one really truly understands. So this idea of the writing being erased, kind of all these things are starting to be connected together here. And then we get another moment where Scrooge's words get twisted back on him as a kind of a punishment. So Scrooge says, well, why don't these children have something? Why don't they have a refuge, somewhere they can go to for safety? That's what refuge means. Why don't they have any things, any food or clothes? That's what he's kind of implying by the word resource. And the Spirit turns around and says, oh, how are there no prisons? So if you remember what Scrooge said to the charity collectors in Stave 1 when they try and help people like ignorance and want, Scrooge basically says, well, the workhouses and the prisons are already there and I already paid to support them, so I've already done my bit. And so now the Spirit is kind of turning back those words on Scrooge as a warning, as a kind of a way of chastising him, telling him off for his insensitivity and his callous behaviour, to make him really think on what he's said and done in the past. And then, because the bell chimes, the ghost vanishes. And Marley's already warned us, remember, in Stave 1, that the ghosts are going to arrive essentially on the hour. So now we get, at the very end of Stave 3, the introduction of our next spirit. So this, of course, is the rather sinister and frightening looking spirit of the ghosts of Christmas is yet to come. So essentially this is the ghost of the future. But we'll look at this particular ghost in more detail when we move on to the next episode on Stave 4. For the time being, though, I'd like us to kind of continue our exploration of some of the language and ideas in Stave 3. In particular, we're going to have a look at this extract where the ghost of Christmas present is introduced to us. We talked about it in the last episode, looked at lots of the kind of language and the use of the imagery of food, the way in which these excessive descriptions of abundant food. We talked about the adjectives great. We talked about words like immense. We talked about the fact that the chestnuts are abundant. And we have the oysters in barrels, these large containers. So there's loads and loads of food linked to the idea of plenty. This is a figure, of course, from mythology. If you cast your minds back to the previous episode, plenty was this kind of figure of nature that kind of bestowed food upon people. Was renowned for carrying a horn stuffed to the brim with food from which it would offer people things to eat. In fact, you can barely even see the horn in this image because it's so overflowing with foodstuffs. But that's the idea. So this is the kind of the image that Dickens has gone for, this gigantic figure of nature bestowing food upon people. Now you might be wondering, well, what's that really all about? Well, ultimately, it's this kind of idea that this kind of spirit represents nature and the abundance of nature, the fact it's kind of quite fat, it's capacious, it's large, it can't be concealed, so it's basically a huge figure. It has ample folds of cloth, so basically it's a large figure because nature has been depicted here as this kind of fat character, full of life and abundance and resources and able to provide for all. And it's also very friendly. So what we have here is a very pleasant and kind, a cheerful depiction of nature, and it contrasts very strongly with a more negative view of nature and what's going to happen to it from people like Thomas Malthus. Remember that Thomas Malthus was the man who felt that if the population grows too much, eventually nature will not be able to support it. But Dickens absolutely loathed that idea. So what we have here, in a way, is a deliberate attempt to challenge Victorian ideas, particularly the ideas of the rich about nature and about this idea that, the poor should be left to their own devices. They should be left to die out or go to prison or workhouses because there's not enough for them and it's on them. Well, Dickens really hated that idea, absolutely loathed it. So what can we do with this extract? So we've got all the imagery of food and plenty. We've got the interesting use of adjectives like capacious. We even get the interesting use of colours. So green, symbolic of nature. White, symbolic of purity. So once you've picked out some of these features, what do we do with it? Where do we go from here? We want to try and develop our writing skills using something called what, how and why. A rather simplified way of writing about something we've read. So what are these different things? What do they entail? Well, what is really just asking ourselves the question, what's Dickens presenting to us here? What's he trying to make us think or feel about it? Trying to come up with some ideas about Dickens's intentions. How is really where we get into our AO2, thinking about language features. So this is where we would pick out some quotes. How is Dickens using language? Are there any interesting structural features? Do we see any literary devices like similes, alliteration, and so on? How is language itself being used? And then, of course, we've got to think about, well, why is he doing it that way? Why might it be important? Are there any intentions? Is there a message here? So a good paragraph will have all three of these elements in it. And I say that it'll have those elements in it. They don't necessarily have to go in that order. There is nothing to stop you having a bit of what and how in the first section, bringing in the why. You might even open with what you think Dickens' intention might be. So we've got to get away from this idea of, I know you may have heard of point evidence analyze or point evidence technique analysis and link. So PEA, PETA, PETAL, all these kind of strange acronyms in the past, but we want to avoid that if we can because they tend to lead to quite kind of a dull, quite mechanical writing. What we really want to do is to kind of engage you in expressing your opinions in a more interesting way. Don't be afraid to mix these parts up. As long as you've got all three ingredients in your paragraph, you're fine. So let's take a look at a potential paragraph idea. So let's take this view that the ghost is being used by Dickens to represent the idea of nature and how it supports all of humanity. So there's a very straightforward sentence about what Dickens is trying to do with the ghost. All right, we've covered this idea that the ghost represents nature, and we're starting to bring in some of the AO3 idea about nature, resources, population, and so on, which we're going to develop in our analysis. So where we go here, well, let's move on to the how. We'll go through it in the order we've got them here for the time being. So how does he do it? Where do we see it in the language? Well, the ghost wears a large green robe trimmed with white fur. So you can see here I'm embedding a quotation. The ghost wears a large green robe trimmed with white fur. The adjective green symbolises this idea of nature and the food provided by the land, while the adjective white has connotations of religious purity and innocence. Dickens reinforces this idea with the excessive list of foods heaped upon the floor and uses a simile to liken it to a kind of throne. So actually, we've got quite a few techniques mentioned here. We've got adjectives, we've got lists, we've got similes. So we're talking about a wide range of AO2 features here, and we're using lots of short embedded quotes as part of the paragraph. Now, if you did that, it's all very well, but you're not really kind of getting into why is Dickens doing it. Okay, yes, he's talking about the ideas of purity in nature, but what's the point to it? Why is it happening in this way? So the core bit, the most important part of the analysis arguably is what comes next, which is why. Why is Dickens doing it that way? So you can see this is going to be the longest part of our paragraph. Dickens clearly aims to present nature as pure, benevolent and bountiful. He might have wanted the reader to recognise the idea that nature can support everyone, not just the privileged few with the wealth and means to exploit its resources. By presenting nature as this capacious character, so again we've even embedded a quote here, look, he not only shows the ghost has grown fat on the foodstuffs provided by nature, but also the very idea that nature's resources are plentiful, abundant and capable of supporting all. Dickens seems to be taking aim here at some of the ideas held by wealthy Victorians, in particular Malthus's economic viewpoint that nature cannot support everyone, and therefore it's desirable that the poor should die as a result of hunger and disease. Malthus felt that the deaths caused by poverty were a natural check against population growth, but Dickens loathed the idea of the Malthusian check. Dickens voices his objection through the spirit's challenge to Scrooge. Will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? And reminds Scrooge, and by extension the rich elite, that from a moral perspective they may be more worthless than the poor because they lack humanity and compassion. Okay, so perhaps not the most brilliant of paragraphs because we're starting to kind of drift off a little bit towards the end here. But what we can do is we can use this sort of second half to kind of set us up for where we go next, moving into some more analysis of perhaps figures like ignorance and want, or going into looking more closely at this idea of where the ghost is trying to show Scrooge lessons around humanity and compassion. But regardless, if you wrote this in the exam, you'd be covering all of AO2, clearly demonstrating your understanding of AO1, bringing in some AO3 with Malthus. So this would be a really solid paragraph of analysis. And it would set you up for some interesting discussions and places where you could go further. And we've only really focused on one tiny bit of the extract, so there's a lot more scope to go further. The most important and most interesting figures we see in this section, of course, are the figures of ignorance and want. So behind the green robes of the character, these two children are being kind of kept, and they're very clearly children in poverty. And they are allegorical characters which represent the plights of the poor. We talked about allegory earlier. So allegory is the noun, allegorical is the adjective. So it's just the expression using symbolic characters, symbolic figures in a story, or some general truths or general ideas about human nature. So ignorance and want are allegorical in how they function in the story. So here they are, introduced to us, the boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling wolfish. So get this nice asyndetic list. Meagre meaning kind of thin, inadequate. Their clothes are ragged and rough. So in fact, they're even kind of described as quite predatory, quite dangerous because they're in such a desperate state. And again, we see that idea of their potential threat in the imagery of devils and their glare and menacing. So what could we do with this? Let's start with the idea of ignorance as a beginning point. Ignorance means, well, essentially not knowing something. And you've got to keep in mind that in Victorian times, education wasn't provided to everyone. If you were from a wealthy family, you probably have a governess who homeschools you, teaches you what you need to know about the world. If you were from a middle-class family, you might be fortunate enough to go to a boarding school or to a school in the town or village where you live and get an education that way. But if you're very, very poor, chances are you'd be forced out to work for the family from a very young age, and you're very unlikely to have had a real education. Dickens felt that education was a way out. So what we have here in this kind of illustration is a picture of what's called a ragged school. And they're so called ragged schools because the children who attended them were from very desperate situations. They were poor. And Dickens, with his friends, sponsored these charitable institutions, trying to provide education to these poor, desperate children. Because Dickens believed very strongly in the idea of social responsibility. He felt that the wealthy had an obligation to do more to support the poor. He felt that the only way we could solve the problems of poverty and crime and suffering and disease and all the things that go with it was through education. So ragged schools and the ragged school movement became very important to him. They were essentially designed as a free education platform for the very, very poor children. And this is partly because Sunday schools, which were like a religious school, technically open to all, in practice often didn't let poor children in because they would be quite dirty and in some cases would have behavioural issues as well. So in 1844, the Ragged Schools Union was established and Dickens and his friends sponsored it, and they also tried to kind of promote its values more widely. They did publish lots of leaflets, these pamphlets, and they went all around the country trying to inspire people to make similar institutions in their particular areas. But this is the key thing. Dickens felt that education was the only way out of poverty. In fact, if you were to look at Dickens' own personal life, he was, for the most part, aside from being a writer, he was a journalist. He liked to travel widely through London and write about his observations on London society. He'd see people from all elements and walks of life, but he was particularly interested in the plight of the poor. So in 1843, he went to Ragged School in Field Lane in Clerkenwell in London, and this area of London, Clerkenwell, is the actual setting of Fagin's Den in Oliver Twist. That's a novel from 1838. So it came out after Christmas Carol, which was published in 1834. But Fagin is the famous leader of a gang of pockets. You may have seen Oliver Twist as a movie or a musical. Perhaps you've even read the story. But Fagin is this sinister character who exploits poor children and kind of corrupts them, turns them to ill, and uses them as his gang of thieves. So while he was in this part of London, Dickens kind of wrote about his observations, and he said that London is a host to a vast, hopeless nursery of ignorance, misery and vice, a breeding place for the hulks and jails. And he laments these frightful neglect by the state of those whom it might as easily and less expensively instruct and save. So, simply put, Dickens felt that schools were a less expensive way of caring for the poor. He felt that education would give them a way out of poverty, so they wouldn't end up in the workhouse or indeed in debtors' prisons. And he felt that was a much better use of time and money, because he felt that poverty essentially would breed criminality and cause problems for everybody, but particularly the poor. And that's why he uses this interesting imagery of a nursery of ignorance, this metaphor, the idea that poverty, in a way, kind of teaches ignorance, it teaches criminality, it teaches poor people to take very unpleasant paths in life. And that's kind of a theme and an idea that runs through a lot of Dickens fiction, not just Christmas Carol, but Oliver Twist as well. So he was very much a proponent of education as a way out of poverty. So how do we see that here in this depiction of ignorance and want in A Christmas Carol? Well, we get this idea that they are humble creatures, they're begging for support. So they're sort of depicted as kind of innocent characters ultimately, but they've been corrupted, they've been made wolfish. It's like, as Dickens points out, it's like a nursery of ignorance. So they've been taught to be cruel, they've been made this way by society. We're reminded by the Spirit that these are man's creation. People have created these things. They aren't sort of this way of their own choice, so much as the circumstances created by society. And we get this lovely kind of use of negative anaphora. So no change, no gradation, no perversion, and so on. So the idea that there's simply nothing so awful in all of humanity as what's happened to these two allegorical children, because it's this idea of the corruption of innocence. So what do we do with it? Well, let's have a look at turning this into another paragraph. But this time, as we mentioned earlier, you can write what, how, and why in any order you like. So let's start this time with how. All right, so Dickens uses a list of horrific and unsettling adjectives to describe ignorance and want. They are depicted as yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. The square brackets, by the way, if you want to insert a word into a quotation, but you want to show your reader that it's not the word from the author, but a word you've added into a quote to help you embed it and for it to make sense, then that's what you do. You put square brackets around it. So scowling and wolfish. The colour yellow implies illness or disease caused by their poverty, and their meagre size suggests they are also malnourished. Similarly, their ragged clothing is a reminder of their harsh living conditions. Moreover, there is also an element of threat here, with Dickens' use of scowling, wolfish and menacing implying that they are hostile and predatory as a result of their desperation. Okay, so that's the how. What would you say for the what or the why? Well, let's go in a strange order. Let's do what next. Okay, so what can we say after this? Well, Dickens clearly wants the reader to understand and reflect upon the harm caused by poverty, not only to the body, but also the mind and spirit. And now the why. Dickens might have chosen to depict ignorance and want as children to show how poverty can turn innocent angels into corrupted devils. So here you can see again, even though we're in the why section now, there's still nothing to stop you embedding some short quotes even here. He's appealing to the reader's religious sensibilities and sense of morality to try to communicate his view that the poor are victims. Dickens was a sponsor of the Ragged Schools movement, so he's a little bit of AO3 here, and these likewise ragged children are the victims of poverty that Dickens wanted the wealthy to support. He earnestly believed that education was a way out of poverty, which he felt caused a perversion of humanity. In a sense, these allegorical figures are being used to teach a moral lesson to readers who might otherwise have not reflected on the plight of the poor. Lots and lots and lots of ideas we've covered in Stave 3, looking at how to write what, how, why paragraphs, looking at some new key vocabulary around allegorical imagery, allegorical characters, and just thinking more broadly about some of the kind of ideas operating throughout Christmas Carol. We'll be moving on in the next episode to look at Stave 4, and eventually, of course, we'll come to Stave 5. So stay tuned for those. But for the time being, thank you for joining us, and I hope you found today's ideas useful, either in your study of A Christmas Carol or indeed in your revision for your upcoming exams. For now, take care and bye-bye.